Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. again. And we actually have another guest with us today that's an amazing person, Hollie McKay, who's also elsewhere live from Washington, D.C. So we're just across town, almost neighbors practically. Hollie, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Really, really grateful to have you. And I have been reading your work for literally years, especially at the time I was had been serving in Afghanistan myself. I was very interested in your take on some things, and especially as it got into the end game there in Kabul and elsewhere in 2021, that you were like right in the middle of all that. And I was still to this day really amazed at how you had access to so many of the places that you had when others were running from that kind of a deal. And I want to talk about that a little bit. But for our guests here who may not be as familiar with you as I am, I want to show everybody just a little clip of what Hollie's path has been to get to us today.
Hollie McKay is a freelance war correspondent and the author of Only Cry for the Living.
With us now from Uzbekistan.
This is Hollie McKay in Kabul.
Mazar Sharif, Taliban capital of Kandahar.
At a camp in the edges of Kabul.
Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan.
Iran, Turkey, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, also Burma, Russia, East Africa.
Sat through military tribunals and interviewed hundreds of soldiers, civilians, and government officials before, during, and after the horrors of war.
We have to understand the way that they think. As a woman by myself, I'm not going in with crews. I don't go with security, so I go very much under the radar.
I really went with the intention of trying to understand, I guess, the human cost of war, and I really just wanted to go and talk to people that lived there. I wanted to understand what it was like to be a displaced person.
I don't think it does us any great favors to sanitize war. I think it's incredibly important to understand the consequences of war, to understand what happens to women and children in war, and to really investigate these war crimes.
When you have to leave your home, what do you take with you? What do you tell your children about why you are leaving? War will show you the best and worst of human beings. So the Yazidis really broke a mold when they came and started to talk about what had happened. You know, you're sitting with all these Talibans and they're bragging about killing Americans.
That the U.S. was engaged in Syria and that finally people in the international community cared.
And you know that you have the privilege of leaving. They have to stay. And if somebody finds out that they were working for an American, everything they've ever had is at risk.
And it just deteriorated so rapidly. It's sort of 1 minute everybody was out and things were just wonderful. The next minute you just started to feel like something was very, very wrong.
And then you just see these motorcycles coming in, and that's the Taliban. There's just hundreds of them, and they're shooting in the air and they're playing their nasheed. I really do love what I do, and at this point in my life, I can't imagine not doing it. I don't know what I would do.
Well, it certainly seems like you've been doing a lot of it, what you've done so far. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how you got into this business. And for someone as young as you are to have been done all of those things, I'm just amazed at how you did that. And I'm really interested to hear.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. So I never planned to sort of get into this space at all. Growing up, I always loved to write, but I never really saw that as a career. I just saw that as something I enjoyed to do on the side. I went to a performing arts boarding school when I was very young and was very dedicated to dance and to ballet. And so I always thought that my career would end up something in the ballet realm. And that's really what my focus was studying, and everything I'd ever kind of worked towards since I was 3. I broke my ankle when I was 18. So that kind of put a bit of a wrench in the works. And I ended up going back to university. Still not really sure what I wanted to do. Got kind of bored and ended up going to New York to finish my degree. And that was in 2006. And I ended up getting this random internship at Fox. And from Australia, we didn't really have internships. That wasn't a thing. But I heard other people talking about it and I thought it sounded sort of interesting. And I really wanted to experience as much of that as I could. So I ended up sending out a few feelers and got a call back and ended up doing a internship at Fox. And at that point, it was very much the beginning of the digital era. So I think a lot of people still wanted to go on broadcast, still wanted to do all of that. Whereas for me, I was really interested in this sort of new medium. So I went down that path and ended up getting sponsored before I'd even finished, and really never went home. And so I began my career very young. I was 20. I was sent to Los Angeles because they were trying to build up their presence in their Bureau of Original Reporting there, and did general assignments. So I could really be anywhere. I could be, at the Oscars one weekend, and then I would be at the Compton Courthouse another weekend, then covering something else investigative, and then there was a fire. And so it was just really this baptism by fire experience. And really at that point, I guess that's when Iraq and Afghanistan were also really heating up, and I just had a curiosity for it. And that's what really drove me to want to cover those stories more and more, because I felt like there were all these things and all these places that I didn't know, that I felt that I should have learned about in school that I really didn't. And in my early 20s, this was the first time I was hearing about these people and these places. And I think that really drove my curiosity, as if I didn't know about it, then how many other people didn't know about it? And what was my job sort of as a writer and a journalist to kind of bridge that gap? And then once I really started doing the international work, I just fell in love with it. And I didn't want to do anything else, or I couldn't imagine doing anything else, because I felt just so deeply passionate about it.
Okay, so I had 4 combat deployments, twice into Afghanistan, and each time I went in there, I was on a base. I had plenty of weapons to defend myself, body armor, the whole thing, helicopters overhead if I needed it. You, on the other hand, didn't have those things. And as you pointed out in that clip we just showed a second ago, you often don't even go with any crew at all, which takes enormous amounts of courage. And if you could just tell us a little bit about where that came from and how that even came about, that you would take that risk the first time, I guess.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it was more initially, that was sort of the way it was. I think in my experience, working in for a sort of a big news channel like Fox, they would put a lot of resources and money and security and things like that into their television personnel. But sort of as a writer, I always felt that I had to be very much on a very stringent budget. So first of all, none of those sort of big security things were kind of ever really properly offered to me. So I kind of, out of necessity, I forged relationships with locals, and then really just started to work with them one-on-one. And then as I sort of got more experience doing that, that just felt like that would be the choice that I would make regardless, because to be kind of immersed with the local culture, to not have that barrier of security, that felt to me like I was living with these people, and I was able to kind of experience things a lot more as the way that they would experience them, without sort of feeling like I was coddled or protected or different from them in some way.
Well, certainly, I mean, that's I think there's a lot of evidence to say that that's the right, that you can get in there more, but you also had to have some concerns. I mean, we've seen other journalists in the same time period you're talking about had some pretty bad ends, especially with ISIS, and you had to be with some of that, but you pressed through anyway.
And I really, I did. And I really trusted the local people that I was with. I really felt very strongly about the decisions that they were making, for where we would and wouldn't go. And a lot of it really, it sounds crazy, but it really comes down to intuition. You have to really trust your gut. You have to know where to go and where not to go. And make those sort of sensible decisions. And a lot of that does come with experience. So I certainly look back a lot of the work I did, especially in my 20s, and probably would not make those decisions now. And so I was quite fortunate in many ways that nothing really horrific happened. But it certainly is a risk. But I also felt in many ways it was a risk worth taking, because they were the stories that I wanted to tell in a way that perhaps no one else was sort of telling in that very intimate setting. And I wanted to do justice to the story as best as possible. And I didn't want to be on the edges. I wanted to be right in the middle.
Yeah, it seemed that you really found your groove there in Afghanistan, because you did a lot of reporting from not in the main areas, but always out in the countryside, talking to the people, especially the women, which were invisible to most of us here. the other thing that I found this remarkable about your reporting, especially late in when things were falling apart in 2021, was that your ability to get access to the Taliban, who obviously had a very low opinion of women and didn't like even anything remotely like equality, but yet they seem to respect and admire you above nearly any other female reporter I'd ever seen. How did you develop that?
I think it really came down to just trying to report things as fairly as possible. And I think one of the things I really noticed throughout the fall, in particular, in those initial few weeks, once the Taliban had taken power in 2021, was that a lot of the things that were coming out, I mean, as horrific as the things that Taliban does, and I'm not trying to minimize them in any way, but a lot of the reporting that was happening, and not from the ground, mind you, a lot of it was being derived from social media, was just inaccurate. There were things of, all sorts of Taliban going door to door and doing these horrific things and on these mass scales, and it just wasn't true. And so I think from their point of view, they were very frustrated at journalists that were kind of reporting things that maybe it had a nugget of truth and then it, spun out into some other story. So I think they appreciated the fact that I was doing whatever I could to stick to the facts. And then I was speaking to people with their stories. I was doing my best to verify the stories. I was giving them an opportunity if they wanted to comment or correct or to put their say into it. So I think that they appreciated that. Although in the beginning, I would say that the Taliban were a lot more open to journalists being there. They were I think they thought they had something to prove, and they wanted to show that they weren't the Taliban from the 90s. And so that they were a lot more receptive to journalists in a way that blew my mind. I mean, there was one time where we just went, my fixer, excuse me, let me call it, my fixer had heard about something strange happening in a kindergarten that was on the edges of Kabul. And we went, and it was a suicide bombing school. And we sort of just knocked on the door and asked, could we come in and do a story? And that was in September of 2021. And they welcomed us in and seemed, very keen to relay their message.
Okay.
But it didn't take long for that to really dwindle. So I think the Taliban quickly realized that even in trying to be open and speaking to journalists, that really wasn't necessarily working in their favor. And I've noticed as the months went on, and in my subsequent trips back to Afghanistan, they really cracked down on media and pretty much decided that it's just not worth their while at all, which is a big shame. So it's a big change from that initial few weeks.
Now that's a characteristic I see continuing through your work and even in the current day, in that you, we're going to show a couple of clips here in a minute about some other reporters who have a very definite slant on how they see things and how they report things. But you seem to consistently be showing that you are after what's actually happening on the ground, actually the truth, meaning that both sides have a point of view, and it's not all just one guy, the good guy, and one guy, the bad guy, good and evil. One is irredeemable, one can't make any mistakes. You seem to show the warts on both sides, and even the valid points of view on each side. We saw this one. This is something you said which I think was very interesting for a couple of different reasons. Within the first few days of the war in Russia and Ukraine, you went on television and said this.
The Ukrainian forces are doing an incredible job of holding the Russians out. And I think we don't know how long that will last. And we don't know, how many resources they have left. And I think we need to continue to go as hard as possible on Russia. The sad thing is that Russian people will drastically suffer as a result of this. And it's really up to them to decide if this is, what kind of leadership they want going forward, because their lives are really have been upended by this as well in a different way.
Now, the view in the United States and in most of Western the world, even at the beginning, but stretching through to this day, is that Putin is Hitler. All the Russians are irredeemable. They're just vicious. They're modern day Nazis. All this kind of stuff, and that they don't have a point of view. But yet, you were actually, even in the beginning, were willing to say, well, they do. They're going to suffer too. This war is not just against the Ukrainian people, but it's also against the other side. And I'm just wondering, how does that distinguish, or not how it does distinguish you, and that you seem to care about both sides? How do you balance that against the maybe the natural inclination to say, well, yeah, this side did start the war, they did invade this country, but they also have a valid point of view? How does that work into your work?
Yeah, I think that's always the way that I approach journalism. Journalism is not activism, and I think that's how it used to be. Was that journalists were able to sort of put themselves into the shoes of every side, and that's how we really were able to paint that holistic picture. And that's something that I really upheld as what true journalism meant. And I think in this day and age where a lot of it is very social media and very personality driven, it's become a lot more, it's blurred the lines with activism. And I think that is not journalism. And that's fine if you are sort of expressing an opinion, but I think that shouldn't be conflated with what journalism is. And I think that's something that I do as much as possible in every country, including a place like Afghanistan, and understanding the Taliban's point of view. Even interviewing ISIS. I went to ISIS territory to interview ISIS in Kunar and Nangarhar to find out what they were doing and why they thought the way that they did. And I think that is how we sort of paint this holistic picture. And we can, I think in war, a lot is lost in communication. So I think journalists play this sort of very prolific role when done right, in trying to piece as many pieces as perspectives together as possible, and presenting that to an audience for the audience to understand and kind of make up their own mind, rather than trying to set an agenda or only really highlight one side. And that's not necessarily being neutral. It's more just trying to understand perspectives so that sides can come together and try to communicate sort of even through that secondhand way.
Yeah. And I think that is really, really playing out right now in this Israel-Hamas war and all the things that go along with that. And I want to get into some detail about that, because as I recall, you said you've actually done some reporting from the region, if not specifically in the Gaza Strip. Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, so I worked there in 2014 when that war was happening in the summer. And then I spent a little bit of time in the region there last year as well.
Okay, great, because that's going to come into play here in just a second. In terms of some reporters not exactly being balanced, shall we say, we have kind of on two different sides here. And I want to just show you just a taste of what is really all the way across the board here on both coverage of this war. First of all, here's a UK reporter.
I would say Israel is the one country in the world never allowed to win a war. You always have to, at best, have a draw. Israel can be attacked, and Israel is allowed to attack a little bit in order to return to the moment just before the attack. That doesn't seem fair to me, nor does it seem to me to be consistent with the rules of war historically. Wars finish when someone wins and someone loses, and the victor knows they've won, and the person who loses knows they've lost.
Now, as we've talked about a lot on our show here, there's a lot of conflation between the terrorist Hamas, who perpetrated this horrific act on 10/7, and the Palestinian people around whom they live within and from where they came from. And it's like the losses of that side almost don't even count. They're almost inconsequential. It's almost like part of the same thing. Now, the other side also views things just from, or there's another side rather that views things that really the Palestinians are completely innocent in everything. And it's just the Israeli side who's at fault. And here's one view of that.
These very open statements of genocidal intent by Israeli officials, including the prime minister and the president and senior cabinet ministers and military officials, who in their public statements have indicated very clearly their intention not to distinguish between civilians and combatants and to carry out the kinds of wholesale slaughter that we are witnessing in Gaza. That is not a justification in international law saying that there was a combatant there for that very disproportionate use of firepower against what was a civilian target.
Now, let me ask, from your experience in the region, I imagine that you probably talk to people on both the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. So first of all, looking at it from the Israeli side, can you explain to us a little bit about what their fears were, and especially the anger that they have after 10/7? Because many of the things I've heard is they say, all right, we're tired of these this is the fifth war we've had with Hamas. And so we have all this history, but not a lot of Americans understand what that is. But from the Israeli position, how did they see things post 10/7?
Yeah, it is very frustrating, I think, for Israelis. This has been going on for a really long time. And as a journalist, I would just say this particular conflict, because it has been going on for so long and because it just seems like both sides are just so far apart, it is very frustrating. And in many ways, it's made it very difficult to cover because you can't. It's hard for me to sort of see an end game with this that is going to in any way appease both sides. It's not going to happen. I don't see it happening. So for the Israelis, I think once October 7 happened, I think they felt as if they had nothing left to lose, that they could, regardless of what they did, it was never going to go over well. So in this particular case, the ground invasion, the assertions that they're going to continue this until Hamas is out of power, even though it has brought a lot of sort of hate upon Israel, if you will. I think that they're at the point now where they kind of just don't care, that they can't appease the international community at the same time in securing their borders. And unfortunately, that means a lot of people on both sides are going to have to suffer. But I do think that in many ways, with a lot of the coverage, the Israeli suffering has sort of been very minimized. And I think that's very frustrating for the Israelis, but they're also at the point now where they sort of just don't care, that they're going to do what it takes to protect Israel. And if that means a lot of Palestinian suffering along the way, that is the risk that they are now sort of going to take to see that Hamas is removed from power.
And now what about from the Palestinian side? Because many of them they've been accused of, well, you voted for Hamas, so you get what you bought, basically, even though that was in 2007 and there were never allowed to have any votes after that. And most of the people who are alive today weren't even alive in 2007 because the population is so young. So how are they viewing this? And if you have any context that are in recent.
And I always say, first and foremost, in any country, people are not their government. Yeah, and the same with Israelis. The Israeli people are not their government. Therefore, it's not fair game to kidnap a bunch of people and slaughter them, and that is in no way justified. And the same goes with Palestinian suffering. And the way I kind of look at it a little bit is if somebody comes to your house and murders your mother, in cold blood, does that sort of give you the right to then find that murderer, kill that murderer, and then kill all their family? And that sort of tends to be the analogy of what seems to happen when Israel goes to war in Gaza. And that's sort of what we're seeing, unfortunately, right now, in an effort to, and not to mention that Hamas does her human shields and all sorts of war crimes. But Israel's sort of approach is I guess, is fairly ruthless when it comes to finding that perpetrator. And if there's a lot of collateral damage in the process, then so be it. And so the international community sort of looks at that and it's very alarming and extremely upsetting. So I think for Palestinians, perhaps in the same way that Israel feels, they also feel like they have nothing left to lose, where martyrdom is the greatest thing that they can possibly achieve because they're living in an environment where there is really not a great deal of hope. It's a place that they can't leave. It's a place that they really can't prosper. And so sort of fighting against the enemy is the greatest thing that a young boy can grow up and do. And I think we've reached a point really where both sides feel they have nothing left to lose. And it's a very dangerous point because we lose sense of that humanity. And then it does become an end game theory where one side has to win eventually. And we don't know what that looks like in the end. For Israel, it's getting rid of Hamas. But what happens the day after that? What happens to the Palestinians the day after that, and who is possibly left in place as a sort of a reasonable governor. So it's an extremely difficult situation where it really does feel lose-lose on every side.
Yeah, President Biden a couple of hours ago tweeted out again an emphatic declaration that the United States backs a two-state solution. One of the big problems is he didn't define what that means. And what I've seen so far is that when Israel says a two-state solution, they mean one thing. And when the Palestinians say they mean a two-state solution, they mean something very different. And given what all has happened, not just since 10/7, but in say the 10 years prior to that, where there was no willingness to talk about that, is there even the capacity or the human will for the two sides to coexist in any form, whatever the definition turns out to be? How do you see that playing out? And if the answer is no, then Israel is not going to be able to achieve its strategic objective of bringing peace to its people, because the violence will continue.
I mean, it is a bleak outlook, but honestly, and I've looked at this in so many ways, and I don't see how these two states can simply sort of operate beside each other in a sort of a peaceful solution. I just don't see what that looks like. They certainly, I don't believe for the most part, can coexist. I think that, for example, if, walls were to be sort of torn down and that sort of free passage back and forth, I think the level of hatred experienced that the Palestinians, many of them feel toward Israel, would result in sort of a daily bloodbath, unfortunately. You'd be seeing attacks, every day, and it would be horrific for Israel. And so I don't really see that happening. And then on the other side of it, you would see Israel continuing to have to employ its very heavy-handed tactics and jail arrests and restrictions like that. So I just don't see, from a very basic safety point of view, how these two different people can really coexist beside each other. And that's not to say certainly that everyone's violent, because it's really only a very small majority that are, but that small majority makes a big difference and can wreak havoc on entire communities. So that really does matter. And I just don't see I don't sort of see that coming together. Even if Hamas was removed from power, I don't necessarily see the Palestinian Authority or any other groups that are there, being particularly open to sort of working with Israel on that front either. So I think it's a very difficult situation. From the other point of view, you sort of have to look at, and this doesn't get brought up a lot, but it's not just an Israeli blockade, it's also an Egyptian blockade. Egypt doesn't want to take in the Palestinians. The Gulf countries don't want to take in the Palestinians. I mean, if they wanted to open from the sea, there would be an opportunity for the Palestinians to build out that way, sort of toward a lot of those Gulf countries. But you don't see that happening. You don't see Gulf countries taking in, vast amounts of Palestinian refugees, and you barely even see Egypt opening its side of the border. So I think that doesn't get acknowledged a lot either, is that this isn't just Israel that's doing this. This is also other countries.
It's a big mess is the bottom line. And I just don't see much groundwork for it, or fundamentals for it to get resolved anytime soon. Before we let you go, though, I want you to, if you could, just talk a little bit about this new book you have, because it's kind of unique here. You've written 3 books here, and Only Cry for the Living, Memos from Inside the ISIS Battlefield. What is the gist of this book, and what led you to write it?
Yeah, well, I was spending a lot of time really living in and out of Iraq and Syria from 2014, really from the beginning of the ISIS onslaught, really through to 2019, when it all sort of came to an end. And I had just mountains of notebooks, and they were just filled with different perspectives and interviews and ideas and places. And I wanted to do something with that. I thought, this was a chance, again, for what we talked about, is presenting all these different sides, the sides of the ISIS fighters, the sides of the Syrian fighters, the sides of the Kurdish fighters, the Iraqi army, every single so the U.S. military as well as just really the civilians, the mothers, the children, the men working at the local store, and how they saw all of this. And so I really wanted to tell this story in a little bit of a chronological fashion. It sort of takes you from the beginning kind of through to that end, but hopefully it brings to light so many different perspectives and so many different moments. And also, I think in many ways it really brings together why the United States has to extend itself into a lot of these places, and often very unfavorably, but really what is at stake if we don't, and this sort of barbarianism that locals have to face, and the reason that we do have to, the world does need that very strong player that the US has been for a long time. And I think that book although that was not my intention, I think that the book really just, it shows what evil is. And evil has a face, and evil has a name, and evil has a perspective, but evil still very much exists. And I think that the book and the notes and things that I put together bring that to life.
Well, appreciate that. I recommend everybody go get that, because it does put a comprehensive view on things that you just don't get anywhere else. You get one side or a slant or none of other sides, and it really helps to understand the complexity of it and just how everything fits together. So recommend everybody go to Amazon, pick that book up, and Hollie, we will continue watching your career as you go forward and be eager to see the next thing that you produce there. So
thank you, Daniel. Thank you for your support.
You bet. Thanks for coming on. And that's all we have for you on this episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised to give you the truth so that you can make sense of the world around you. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Deep Dive.